Bill Maher, 69, leaned forward in his chair, his sharp eyes glinting with the thrill of a fight. He'd built a career on provocation, his quick wit slicing through political dogma with equal disdain for left and right. But tonight he had a target in Eastwood, whose latest film, a raw, unflinching drama about a veteran navigating a fractured America, had ignited fierce debates on X. For the older crowd, many of whom had grown up on Dirty Harry and Unforgiven, Eastwood wasn't just a filmmaker. He was a symbol of a time when grit and principle trumped posturing. Maher didn't waste time. Clint, his voice laced with sarcasm. Clint, your new film's got people on X calling it a MAGA manifesto. You stirring the pot on purpose, or is this just old man nostalgia? The jab landed like a slap. The audience gasped, a mix of shock and uneasy laughter rippling through the seats. Older viewers, clutching their programs, exchanged glances. A retired accountant from Santa Barbara, his Gran Torino DVD still on his shelf, muttered to his wife, "That's uncalled for." She nodded, her lips tight. Eastwood's films had been their touchstones, stories of justice, sacrifice, and quiet strength. To them, Maher's tone felt like a cheap shot at a man who'd earned his stripes. Eastwood sat still, his weathered face unreadable, hands folded in his lap. At 94, he carried the weight of decades, actor, director, cultural titan. His silence stretched, heavy, as the studio air grew thick with tension. Then his voice, low and gravelly, cut through. "I tell stories, Bill, not tweets. If you want to talk about the movie, fine. But don't put words in my mouth." The room erupted, claps, cheers, a few boos. For the over 55 crowd, it was a gut punch of validation. They felt it too, the dismissal of their values, the relentless noise of a world that prized outrage over substance. A woman in a navy blazer, a former nurse, whispered to her friend, "He's one of us." Her friend nodded, eyes glistening. Maher, caught off guard, raised his hands, feigning surrender. "All right, no words in your mouth. But let's not pretend you're above the culture war, Clint. Your films, Dirty Harry, American Sniper, they've always picked a side." The accusation hung in the air. Eastwood's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed he might walk off. The stage manager, visible in the wings, froze, her clipboard trembling. The older audience members leaned forward, their loyalty to Eastwood clashing with the unease of watching an icon cornered. It wasn't just about the film, it was about a generation feeling mocked, their heroes reduced to punchlines. Then Eastwood did something no one expected. Instead of storming off, he leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Maher's. "You know, Bill, I've seen a lot of fights in my time. Political, personal, you name it. They all start the same way. People stop listening. You're not listening right now. You're performing." The studio went silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Maher blinked, his usual smirk faltering. The audience held its breath, sensing a shift. Eastwood's voice stayed calm, but each word carried the force of a lifetime. "You want to talk about my film? Let's talk. But don't turn it into your circus. People deserve better." The older viewers felt a surge of pride. A man in a faded Marine's cap, his hands weathered from years as a mechanic, nodded slowly, whispering to his son, "That's why he's Clint." His son, a Gen Zer dragged along, gave a grudging nod. For a generation raised on Eastwood stoicism, this was their voice, steady, unyielding, calling for reason in a world gone mad. Maher, visibly rattled, tried to pivot. "Fair enough, Clint. Let's talk the film. It's about a veteran, right? What's the message there?" Eastwood eased back, his tone softening but still firm. "It's about a man who's lost his way, fought for his country, came home to a place he doesn't recognize. It's not about left or right. It's about finding something worth holding on to." The audience leaned in, hanging on his words. The nurse in the navy blazer saw her late husband in the story, a Vietnam vet who'd struggled to fit back in. The accountant thought of his estranged daughter, a progressive activist who hadn't called in years. Eastwood's film wasn't just a movie, it was their lives laid bare. The senator on the panel, sensing the mood, jumped in with a safe question about veterans' care, but the moment belonged to Eastwood. He'd flipped the script not with anger, but with a quiet call for respect that cut deeper than any of Maher's barbs. The older crowd felt it in their bones, a reminder that their values, their stories, still mattered. As the show cut to commercial, the studio buzzed with whispers. "Did you see Bill's face?" a woman in a red sweater said to her husband, a retired cop. Clint shut him down. Her husband chuckled, shaking his head. Man still got it. Backstage, the mood was frantic. Producers huddled, debating how to steer the rest of the show. Maher sipped water, his jaw tight, while Eastwood sat calmly, sipping from a paper cup. The stage manager approached, nervous. "Mr. Eastwood, you good to continue?" He gave a faint smile, the kind that had disarmed outlaws on screen for decades. "I've been through worse." When the show resumed, Maher was quieter, his questions less sharp. Eastwood spoke about his film with a passion that felt personal, describing the veteran's struggle with a clarity that silenced the room. The older audience saw themselves in his words: loss, resilience, the search for meaning in a world that seemed to have moved on. But the real shock came after the taping. As the audience filed out, a small group lingered near the stage, hoping for a glimpse of Eastwood. Among them was Evelyn, 72, a widowed librarian from Pasadena. She'd driven alone, the bridges of Madison County VHS worn from rewatching. Clutching a photo from Unforgiven, she approached Eastwood, her voice trembling. "Mr. Eastwood, what you said out there. It meant something. My husband passed last year. He was a Marine. Felt like no one cared about his service. You made me feel like someone still does." Eastwood looked at her, his eyes softening. "I'm sorry for your loss, Evelyn. Your husband's service mattered. Don't let anyone tell you different." The words were simple, but they hit like a lifeline. Evelyn's eyes welled up as she stepped back, clutching the photo. Others approached, a Korean War vet, a teacher estranged from her woke son, each sharing a piece of their lives. Eastwood listened, his presence steady, a quiet anchor in their storm of emotions. Maher, watching from the wings, felt a pang he couldn't name. He was used to winning debates, landing punches. But Eastwood hadn't fought. He disarmed, not with wit, but with something deeper: empathy, conviction, a refusal to play the game. For Maher, it was a rare moment of doubt. For the audience, it was a triumph. As Eastwood left the studio, the Los Angeles night swallowed him, car horns blaring, neon signs flickering. The city churned on, oblivious to the ripple he'd started. But for those who'd been there, especially the over 55 crowd, the evening was a spark. At diners and VFW halls, in living rooms and church groups, they'd talk about it for weeks. "Did you hear what Clint said to Maher?" they'd say, their voices alive with pride. "He spoke for us." It wasn't a viral moment, though clips would circulate on X, dissected by pundits and trolls. It was something quieter, more enduring, a reminder that even in a world of noise, a single voice, steady and true, could shift the air. And for Eastwood, it was another story told, another mark left on a world he'd spent a lifetime shaping. What happened next would ripple far beyond the studio, touching lives in ways no one could predict. "You all right, boss?" Ray asked, his voice gruff but warm. Eastwood leaned back, his eyes fixed on the city blurring past. "Just another day, Ray." But it wasn't. The confrontation with Bill Maher had struck a nerve, not just in the audience, but in Eastwood himself. He'd spent decades telling stories about men and women grappling with a changing world, but tonight felt different. It wasn't about the film or even Maher's barbs, it was about the people in that audience, the ones like Evelyn, the librarian, whose stories mirrored his own films. They were the reason he kept going, long past the age when most would have retired to a ranch in Montana. Back at the studio, Maher was still reeling. He sat in his dressing room, the door half open, the buzz of the crew fading as they packed up. At 69, he was used to being the sharpest voice in the room, but Eastwood had outmaneuvered him, not with quips, but with a quiet authority that left Maher feeling oddly exposed. He replayed the moment in his head. You're not listening. You're performing. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. A knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Sarah, his producer, her tablet glowing with notifications. Bill, X is blowing up. Clips from the show are everywhere. People are calling it Eastwood's takedown. You want to respond. Maher rubbed his temples. Let it ride. Anything I say now will just fan the flames. Sarah hesitated. There's something else. A group of audience members, mostly older folks, are still outside. They're talking about starting some kind of petition, something about respecting our stories. It's gaining traction. Maher frowned. A petition? For what? They're saying the media, us included, keeps dismissing their generation. They're quoting Clint, saying they want to be heard, not mocked. Maher leaned back, a mix of irritation and curiosity flickering across his face. He'd built his brand on challenging everyone, but tonight he'd misjudged. Eastwood hadn't just defended himself. He'd given voice to a silent majority, people over 55 who felt sidelined in a culture obsessed with youth and outrage. For the first time in years, Maher wondered if he'd lost touch. Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn sat in her modest Pasadena apartment, the unforgiven photo now propped on her mantel. She couldn't sleep, her mind replaying Eastwood's words. Your husband's service mattered. It was the first time in months she'd felt seen. She opened her laptop, her hands trembling slightly, and found a thread on X about the show. The comments were a mix of snark and praise, but one caught her eye, a post from a man named Harold, a retired mechanic, who'd been at the taping. Clint spoke for all of us tonight. We're not invisible. Who's with me? Evelyn hesitated, then typed a reply. I'm with you, Harold. My husband was a Marine. His story deserves to be heard. She hit send, her heart racing. Within minutes, others chimed in, veterans, teachers, grandparents, all over 55, sharing snippets of their lives. The thread grew, a quiet rebellion against a world that seemed to have forgotten them. By morning, the story had spread beyond X. Local news picked it up, framing it as Eastwood's stand against cancel culture. The narrative was oversimplified, but it resonated with older Americans, who saw in Eastwood a champion of their values, resilience, respect, the power of a well-told story. At a diner in Orange County, a group of retirees debated the show over pancakes, their voices animated. Clint didn't yell or grandstand, said a former firefighter named Tom. He just said what needed saying. That's what's missing today. Tom's friend, a widowed schoolteacher named Ruth, nodded. It's not just about Clint. It's about us. I'm tired of being told my life doesn't matter because I'm old school. Their conversation wasn't unique. From VFW halls in Ohio to church groups in Texas, the over 55 crowd found themselves galvanized. They weren't marching in the streets or trending on X, but they were talking, really talking, about their frustrations, their pride, their hope for a world that still valued them. And at the center of it all was Eastwood, an unlikely catalyst who'd done what he always did, told a story that hit home. Eastwood, meanwhile, was back at his Carmel home, a modest ranch overlooking the Pacific. He sat on the porch, the morning fog rolling in, a script open on his lap. His phone buzzed with messages, reporters, friends, even a text from his daughter, Morgan. Dad, you're trending. You okay? He chuckled, setting the phone aside. Trending wasn't his world, but the letters piling up on his desk were. Fans, mostly older, had started writing, sharing stories of their lives, veterans, farmers, nurses, people who saw themselves in his films. One letter from a 78-year-old widower in Nebraska read, You reminded me I still have a voice. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood. He read each one, his eyes lingering on the words. It wasn't fame he cared about, it was connection. That's why he'd faced Maher's barbs head-on, not with anger, but with a call to listen. And now, people were listening, not just to him, but to each other. Back in Los Angeles, Maher was grappling with his next move. His team urged him to address the backlash on the next show, maybe even invite Eastwood back. It'd be ratings gold, Sarah said, scrolling through analytics. But Maher wasn't so sure. He'd spent years poking the bear, but Eastwood wasn't a bear, he was a mirror, reflecting something Maher hadn't seen in himself, a performer more interested in winning than understanding. At a coffee shop near the studio, Maher overheard two older women discussing the show. "I used to like Bill," one said, stirring her latte. "But he crossed a line with Clint. It's like he doesn't get what we've been through." Her friend nodded. "Clint gets it. He always has." Maher turned away, the words lingering. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own platform. He'd always prided himself on speaking truth to power, but had he become the power, dismissing those who didn't fit his narrative? The thought gnawed at him. A week later, the ripple effect was undeniable. Evelyn and Harold, now connected through X, had organized a small gathering at a Pasadena community center. They called it Our Stories Matter, a space for older Americans to share their experiences, war stories, career triumphs, family struggles. It wasn't political, though the media tried to spin it that way. It was personal. Over 50 people showed up, their faces lined with age, but their voices strong. Evelyn spoke about her husband's service. Harold shared his years fixing cars for neighbors who couldn't pay. A woman named Clara, 80, talked about teaching in a one-room schoolhouse. Each story was a thread, weaving a tapestry of lives too often overlooked. The event caught Eastwood's attention. He didn't attend, publicity wasn't his style, but he sent a handwritten note, read aloud by Evelyn to a hushed room. "Keep telling your stories. They're the heart of who we are." Clint. The crowd erupted in applause, tears streaming down Clara's face. For them, it was more than a note. It was proof they weren't invisible. Maher, meanwhile, made a decision. On the next Real Time, he opened with a rare mea culpa. "Last week I went hard at Clint Eastwood," he said, his tone softer than usual. "I thought I was being clever, but I missed the point. He was right, we need to listen, not just perform. So I'm listening. Tell me your stories." The audience, many over 55, clapped cautiously. It wasn't a full redemption. Maher's edge was still there, but it was a start. He invited Evelyn and Harold onto the show, giving them a platform to share their initiative. The segment wasn't flashy, but it struck a chord. Letters poured into HBO, mostly from older viewers, thanking Maher for giving them a voice, even if it was belated. Eastwood watched the episode from his porch, a faint smile on his lips. He didn't need the spotlight, he never had. But seeing Evelyn's nervous but proud face on screen, hearing Harold's steady voice, he felt something close to peace. He'd spark something, not with a fist or a shout, but with a quiet stand for respect. The movement grew, small but steady. Our Stories Matter events popped up in towns across the country: Modesto, Tulsa, Boise. They weren't protests or rallies, just people over 55 gathering to talk, to listen, to reclaim their place in a world that seemed to have moved on. On X, younger users began joining the conversation, sharing stories of their grandparents, bridging gaps that had felt unbridgeable. And yet, the story wasn't finished. Eastwood, back at work on his next film, felt a new urgency. The letters on his desk, the voices at the community centers, they were fuel, pushing him to tell one more story, maybe his last. Maher, too, was changing, his monologues now laced with a humility that surprised even his critics. And for the millions who'd watched that night, especially those over 55, the spark lingered, a reminder that even in a fractured world, a single moment of understanding could light the way forward. The future was uncertain, but it shimmered with possibility. A new conversation had begun, and no one, not even Eastwood, could predict where it would lead. The fog rolled in over Carmel, cloaking Clint Eastwood's ranch in a soft, gray hush. At 94, he sat on his porch, a wool blanket draped over his knees, the Pacific's steady churn a familiar companion. A half-finished script lay on the table beside him, but his eyes were on the horizon, where sea met sky in an unbroken line. The past year had been a whirlwind. His clash with Bill Maher on Real Time had sparked Our Stories Matter, a movement that had grown from a single Los Angeles theater to community centers and church halls across America. For the over 55 crowd, it was more than a platform. It was a lifeline, a way to reclaim their place in a world that often overlooked them. The letters still came, though slower now, each one a window into lives shaped by resilience and quiet sacrifice. A 79-year-old truck driver from Idaho wrote of his years hauling freight to feed his family. A 67-year-old nurse from Atlanta shared how she'd cared for patients during the AIDS crisis. Eastwood read them all, his fingers tracing the words, their stories fueling his own. His latest film, The Long Road, was in post-production, a quiet tale of an aging farmer mentoring a runaway teen, inspired by the letters. It wasn't meant for Oscars or X debates. It was for the people who'd seen themselves in his work for decades. In Los Angeles, Bill Maher was navigating a new chapter. At 70, he'd softened, though his edge remained. The real-time episode with Evelyn and Harold had changed him, forcing him to confront his own role in the noise he often mocked. Eastwood's words, "You're not listening. You're performing," still echoed, a challenge he couldn't shake. He'd started featuring more everyday voices on his show, a retired welder from Pittsburgh, a librarian from Boise, their stories drawing record numbers of older viewers. "I'm not turning into Oprah," he quipped to his producer Sarah, "but maybe I'm done swinging at every pitch." His audience, especially those over 55, noticed the shift. Their letters to HBO, a mix of gratitude and cautious hope. "Our Stories Matter," had taken on a life of its own. Evelyn, now 73, and Harold, 68, had become its heart, organizing events that drew hundreds in places like Des Moines, Spokane, and Savannah. The gatherings weren't political, though pundits tried to label them as such. They were human, spaces where gray-haired veterans, teachers, and grandparents shared their lives over coffee and folding chairs. In a Cleveland rec center, a 75-year-old electrician recounted building skyscrapers in the 70s. In a Tucson library, a 62-year-old seamstress spoke of sewing prom dresses for girls who couldn't afford them. Each story was a thread, stitching together a generation that refused to be forgotten. The movement's biggest moment came with National Story Day, Evelyn's ambitious plan to unite storytellers across the country. On a crisp October Saturday, thousands gathered in town squares, VFW halls, and living rooms, sharing tales of love, loss, and grit. In Pasadena, Evelyn stood before 200 people, her voice steady as she read from her late husband's Marine Corps journal. Harold followed, sharing how fixing cars for struggling neighbors had taught him community. The crowd, mostly over 55, their faces lined with age and wisdom, listened in reverent silence, some holding hands, others wiping tears. Eastwood couldn't attend. He'd been battling a cold, and his doctor had insisted he rest, but he sent a video message, recorded on his porch. The screen flickered to life in Pasadena, his weathered face filling the frame. "You don't need me to tell you your stories matter," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "You're proving it every day. Keep talking. Keep listening. That's how we stay alive." The room erupted, applause shaking the rafters. A 71-year-old widow in the back, clutching a photo of her late son, whispered to her friend, "He's still with us." Maher surprised everyone by hosting a real-time special for National Story Day. He scrapped his usual format, inviting Evelyn, Harold, and 3 others, a farmer, a bus driver, and a retired cop, to share their stories. The audience, heavy with older faces, hung on every word. The farmer spoke of saving his land during the 80s farm crisis. The bus driver recounted driving kids to school through blizzards. Maher for once stayed quiet, his usual quips replaced by nods and the occasional, "That's incredible." The episode ended with a montage of stories from across the country, set to a simple piano score. Viewers at home, especially those over 55, flooded HBO with letters, one calling it the first time I felt TV saw me. The special aired the same week The Long Road premiered in select theaters. It wasn't a blockbuster, Eastwood hadn't aimed for that, but it struck a chord. In a small cinema in Omaha, a packed house of retirees and their families watched in silence, tears glinting in the dark as the farmer and teen found common ground. After the credits, a 66-year-old carpenter stood and clapped, his wife joining him, then the whole room. The film's dedication to the storytellers flashed on screen, and for the audience, it felt personal, a nod to their own lives. The movement wasn't perfect. Some events fizzled, not every family reconciled. X still churned with snark, dismissing the gatherings as boomer nostalgia. But the over 55 crowd didn't care. They weren't chasing virality, they were building something lasting. In Maine, a 70-year-old fisherman started a memoir workshop. In Arizona, a 64-year-old nurse recorded oral histories for her tribe. Small acts, but they rippled. Grandkids began asking questions, family dinners grew longer, and stories once locked in attics found new life. Eastwood, recovering at home, received a final letter from Evelyn. National Story Day was a success, she wrote. Over 10,000 people joined nationwide. We're planning next year's already. You didn't just start this, you gave us hope. Enclosed was a photo of the Pasadena event, Evelyn and Harold beaming amid a sea of smiling faces. Eastwood pinned it to his corkboard, beside other letters, a quiet monument to the movement. Maher, too, was changed. He and Eastwood exchanged occasional notes, a grudging respect forming. On Real Time, Maher's humor grew sharper but kinder, his targets more precise. I'm not here to save the world, he told a guest, but maybe I can pass the mic. His older viewers, once skeptical, now tuned in faithfully, seeing in him a man who'd stumbled but stood back up. As winter blanketed Carmel, Eastwood took one last walk along the beach, the sand cold under his boots. He thought of the letters, the faces at the premiere, the voices that had filled community centers. He'd spent a lifetime telling stories, but this movement, this spark, was his greatest yet. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it was real, a tapestry of lives woven by people who refused to fade. Across America, the over 55 crowd carried on. In a Montana diner, a 68-year-old rancher shared his father's Dust Bowl stories with a young waitress, who wrote them down. In a Florida library, a 73-year-old poet read her work to a small but rapt crowd. The stories weren't always grand, but they were true, each one a spark in the dark. The world kept turning, noisy and divided. But in those quiet moments over coffee, under porch lights, in the glow of a theater screen, something endured. It wasn't a victory carved in stone, but a promise, fragile yet fierce, that every story mattered, and every voice could still be heard. For Eastwood, Maher, Evelyn, Harold, and millions of others, that was enough. The future stretched wide, unwritten, but it shimmered with the hope that even the smallest step could light the way.